Hello, welcome back to Six Pathways to Happiness. This is a talk on mindfulness of mind. This is for more intermediate and advanced folks, so it's perfectly fine for you to pass on this at any point along the way. To begin the story, I need to go back almost 10 years now to 2011. A number of us went together upon invitation from a large monastery in Houston, Texas, Buddhist monastery. Master was invited, and he brought several of the teachers along with him, the lay teachers, to give some presentations and talks. In the airport in St. Louis, as we were flying to Houston, the plane was a little bit delayed, and I talked to Master. I said, Master, I really don't understand mindfulness of mind. There are all of these terms. They don't make sense to me. I tried reading some commentaries. Could you help me out? And the Master said, look at the Chinese resources. I said, okay. So after we got back, it was a difficult time because at that time in Houston, they were having a very serious drought. And I remember going to the beautiful monastery there, and so many trees had died. But we had a very good time with the people there. And when we got back, I said, okay, I'm going to really try to understand mindfulness of mind. And looking at the Chinese resources was helpful. It took me a couple of years, but then I was ready to give a talk. And after I gave the talk, and I had put quite a bit of time and energy into this, and I remember that many people were there at the Buffalo Lodge at that time, where there were several different layers of places where people could sit up in the balconies, second and third floor, and the place was very, very busy, very, very beautiful time. And I gave my talk, and afterwards, outside, as I was walking away, the Master said, "Oh, Don Chushu, Uncle Don." Then he said, "Very good talk." Rarely did the Master ever say anything like that. I said, "Oh, thank you, thank you." He says, "You got half of it." Oh, no, I thought. At the university, if you get 50%, you fail. So I said to Master, "What's the other half?" And he turned around and walked away. So that was 7-8 years ago. So now I've studied more, and I can confidently say that I got half of the other half. So now maybe 75%, I'm just at the level of a C now at the university. But here I'm just going to present some of the basics. The more advanced stuff I'll leave for later, another time. So I'm going to try to put together an understanding of something from both the Satipatthana Sutta and the Anapanasati Sutta. Satipatthana means the foundations of mindfulness. Sati is mindful. Anapanasati anapana means breathing. Sati means mindful. So mindfulness of the breath. These are two very important suttas that the Buddha gave, discourses that the Buddha gave on the practice of meditation. So Satipatthana starts off with mindfulness of the body, then goes to mindfulness of feeling, then mindfulness of mind in 16 parts, and mindfulness of phenomena. Today we're going to talk about mindfulness of the mind in the 16 parts, or 8 pairs. Anapanasati, the mindfulness of the breath, the beginning of that teaching is on the stages of the path, or the stages of practice. And then talks about mindfulness of in and out breathing in 16 parts, and those are divided into 4 tetrads. that mirror the body, feeling, mind, and phenomenon. So we'll be talking about the third tetrad. And then it goes on to talk about the 7 factors of awakening, which are also in mindfulness of phenomenon, and clear knowing and release. So if you go into a lot more detail, and I'm not going to do a lot of this here, I'm just going to be talking about mindfulness of mind, but you can see how all of the different parts interconnect, and at some point maybe you'll be interested in understanding some of the depth of these things. One of the things that I will say is about the stages of the practice at the top of the Anapanasati. This was talk was given by the Buddha when there was a long retreat at Savatthi, and the rain was still falling even after 3 months. The monsoon season had continued long after they had expected, so the Buddha said to the disciples, "Oh, monks, stay here for another month." And during that time, he went from group to group, and he wondered what they were practicing. So first he started with the arahats, the most advanced, then to the non-returners, and then the once-returners, and then to the stream enterers. And then he went to a group that were all practicing the 4 Brahma Viharas: loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. And then he went to the next group. They were practicing the 37 factors of awakening. That includes the 4 foundations of mindfulness. That's the beginning part. And then he went to the group that was doing in and out breathing, the basic in and out breathing technique. And then he presents the more advanced teaching on mindfulness of in and out breathing, called Anapanasati in 16 parts, the 4 tetrads that have to do with the body, feeling, mind, and phenomenon. And again, we're going to be focusing on the mind here. So if we break down the 4 foundations of mindfulness, we can see that there are these different dimensions that have to do with feeling. And if you want to learn more about that, I have a talk on mindfulness of feeling. And then when we get into the different practices that have to do with the mind, we'll go into more detail. But I want to start with Anapanasati, the mindfulness of the breath, Majjhima Nikaya 118, in the 16 parts. So what are the 16 parts? Here they are. The tetrad, number 1, mindfulness of the body. Then tetrad 2, mindfulness of feeling. Tetrad 3, mindfulness of mind. Tetrad 4, mindfulness of phenomenon. So if we go in, we can see here without the labels. Breathing in long, I breathe in long, or breathing out long, I breathe out long, or breathing in short, I breathe in short, or breathing out short, I breathe out short. Breathing in sensitive to the entire body. Breathing out sensitive to the entire body. Breathing in calming the bodily formation or fabrication, the breath. Breathing out calming the bodily formation, the breath. And I have it here in the Pali as well as in the Chinese and the Pinyin. So many of you who have been doing the other meditations, you know that I always start off with this practice, because in the beginning of almost all of the meditations that the Buddha gives, he gives this as the introduction. And then he goes into the second tetrad, breathing in sensitive. And the term rapture, I could go into more detail about these kinds of things, that I have some questions about how these words translate into modern English. But this has to do with the jhana factor of joyfulness that comes internally. And the third, sensitive to pleasure. This is a deep happiness that's grounded not in the external world, but in the internal world. And mental formations, this has to do with certain mental factors that are active in the mind and calming the mental formations as well. But this is to talk on mindfulness of the mind. So we go to step 9, 10, 11, and 12 that talks about sensitive, breathing in sensitive to the mind, satisfying the mind, steadying the mind, and releasing the mind. So this is something that's very important that we need to understand in more detail, what that means. So we can see here without the Pali and the Chinese how things are divided. Sensitive to the mind. So we want to see what's going on inside the mind. We want to understand, is the mind preoccupied with desires, greediness, passions, lust? I want what I want. I want to get more of what I want. Or is the mind free of that? When we talk about satisfying in the mind, is the mind satisfied with the progress that it's made? Is it pleased with the path that it's on? Is it able to practice without too much distraction? Is the mind able to be unified and develop? This is called satisfying the mind. Steadying the mind. Can the mind go deeper? Can the mind actually enter into the deeper stages of concentration? And then releasing the mind, is the mind able to become liberated, free from the suffering, at least decreasing and then stopping the suffering? And then, of course, the later techniques are things that we'll talk about at another time. The Viveka formula of dispassion and cessation and relinquishing. So, as we talk about here, this is the what we really want. It says, he trains himself. I will breathe in sensitive to the mind. He trains himself. I will breathe out sensitive to the mind. But again, we have to know what that means. And that's what this meditation is about. When you go through the meditation, you'll see that the guided meditation helps us to remember what this means to be sensitive to be satisfied, to be steady, and how to release. So this third tetrad is very important, to wake the mind up. Yes. So mindfulness of mind in Satipatthana is rather deep. This was the thing that really tripped me up when I was going with Master, and I really wanted to understand. This was the teaching that I was having difficulty with. This is what I tried to study when I came back from Houston. So Satipatthana and Mahasatipatthana in the Pali means the four foundations of mindfulness are found in these two suttas, and for our purposes, the selections, particularly on the mindfulness of mind, they're identical. So we don't have to worry about studying two different versions. In the Agamas, now the Agama is the Chinese resources. These are the texts that came by way of translators from India. They had translated these from the Pali, usually into Sanskrit or Prakrit or even the Gandhara language, and then it found its way into China, and they were translated into Chinese by a number of very important translators. We won't go into those kinds of things right now. And the same kind of texts were developed, and the ones that we're going to be looking at for the Satipatthana Sutta were in two Chinese agamas, one called Majjhima Agama 98 and the Ekatara Agama number 12.1. And these translations are not identical, they're different. So, mindfulness of the body, this is a review. We want to look at the 13. So, pairs number 1 through 3 are the knowledge of the 3 poisons. Pairs 4 through 6 have to talk about levels of development, and pairs 7 and 8, this has to do with realization. That's another way of organizing this. There are 8 pairs of opposites, although some of them are kind of tricky. There are unclear parts. For example, in part number 4, the Pali does not have an opposite, but it looks like it only has 2 unwholesome hindrances. And the Agama straightens that out. In part 5, we need to understand what's developed. Is it the Brahma-viharas? Is it the Apamanas? What's going on? In number 6, what does it mean when he says superior state? So here we are, and we look at the first part has to do with whether or not a person is with or without lust, with or without hate, with or without ignorance. Now, those people who are familiar with the teaching will know that this has to do with the 3 poisons. Number 4, this samkita is a very complicated term. And we're going to translate this as unification here, and the opposite being distractedness. And as you'll see, there are various translations of this, and I will try to explain why I have chosen unification. I'm not the only one. Venerable Analio also has really spoken a great deal about this problem in the sutta. Mahagata, the development and without development. The anuttara, when something is superior or nothing is superior to it. And then samadhi, which is really samadhi. This is concentration, whether we have concentration or don't, and then eventually liberation. So we can compare. We can say that the first 3 parts are related to sensitive to the mind. Is the mind with or without lust, hate, or ignorance? The next 2 parts, satisfying the mind, have to do with whether the mind is unified or scattered, developed or not developed. And then when we go to studying the mind, we can find out whether are we in a surpassed state or not a surpassed or unsurpassed state. Are we concentrated or not concentrated? And then finally, we release the mind. We're liberated. So in mindfulness of mind, we're going to combine this anapanasati and satipatthana into one practice. And be aware that the translation of certain terms in satipatthana can be complex, but this is a subject for another time. If we go into too much detail here, when you do the practice, confusion will set in. Please try to have confidence in the fact that there are ways that we can practice this meditation without having to understand all of the Pali and all of the Chinese. We really just want to understand the mind. And the mind is the same, whether Chinese mind, whether it's Indian mind, whether it's American mind, makes no difference. European mind, all minds are pretty much the same. Once you know one mind, then easier to know other minds as well. Remember that most important is to do this in a compassionate way to yourself. If you notice, I have greediness in my mind, please be gentle with yourself and say, this next year, this next month, this next week, this next day, I will try to be less greedy. I have anger in my mind. Don't get angry with yourself for having anger. Just resolve in yourself. This next year, this next month, this next week, this next day, this next moment, hour, I am going to do my best not to be angry. Right in the here and now. I'll learn how to restrain this and turn it into something that is much more compassionate and caring. The same thing with, I just don't know things. There's something wrong with me. I'm not very smart about this. It's hard for me to remember all these lists. Be gentle and kind to yourself. It takes a long time. This may or may not be very familiar to you based on your past practices. So be kind to yourself. If the mind is very scattered and very distracted, be gentle. The harder we are, the more difficult it is. Be kind to yourself as your mind will become more and more unified over time. And the same thing with its development and how it enters into the deeper states and eventually is liberated. It's my great hope that this will happen for each of us, and that we will not only be kind to ourselves, but we will also be kinder to others. Be well, go forth, practice well, and I'm interested to hear about how this is working out for you. Again, this is an intermediate practice, so good to practice calming the mind first, learning how to have a little insight, and also loving kindness and compassion, and practicing mindfulness of feeling in the right order so that you eventually can get to this place of mindfulness of mind. Thank you so much. I wish you all well.